So you can move the slide. Thanks so much, Sage. So we have a really big team, and it took all of us to pull this together. We'll talk a little bit about why. There were lots of moving parts to this particular research. Incredibly grateful to True for the funding to do this research. And I'm fortunate to have Florriann and Tracy with me today talking about our findings. Next slide. So it's not news that the transition to professional, that the transition to professional practice is a difficult one. It's been that way for a very long time. I do think the variables have changed significantly, and our understanding of the experience has also changed. For those of you old enough to remember Marlene Kramer, she really did the original work in this area of transition to practice and created an idea that she shared with other, as I have shared with other researchers, called reality shock. That's how she approached it. And she spoke of the phases of a new graduate entering practice, but the premise was that there was this tremendously difficult, shocking kind of experience when the graduates first enter practice. And there's a lot of reasons that we can talk about around that. Some of them have to do with the way that we educate, and some of them have to do with the way that we onboard or transition nurses into the workplace. But there's no denying the fact that there are challenges to coming into practice, and they've certainly been exacerbated by COVID. And I'm more than pleased to talk about my experiences with graduates over the last 1.5 to 2 years related to COVID, if time permits. So the statistics are not pretty when it comes to new graduates' level of satisfaction with the workplace. And although the statistics are not all that contemporary, many people are quoting statistics from a while ago, and I think that COVID has significantly altered the landscape into which they are transitioning, and that has made it far more problematic. And there are many reasons for that. Some of the reasons have to do with the educational experience. Some of them have to do with the new grads themselves. And some of them have to do with the very challenging experience their senior practitioners are having, that they're trying to navigate themselves while supporting these new nurses coming into practice. Next slide, please. So I want to talk, you can probably roll that through, Sage. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about what we did and why we did it that way. Our intent was to look at the transition experience from the lens of what was it like to be a part of an educational culture and then integrate into a workplace culture, and how were we able to bridge that culture through mentorship. I also wanted to look at the transition over time in terms of mentorship. And very specifically, I wanted to ensure that we respected the stages of transition as we were working through the integration of new graduates, because that's something that is often missing in new graduate support programs, is that the mentorship is sort of like this is what mentorship is, knock yourself out. I don't think that is as beneficial for the new graduate, and it became really clear to me in this study that mentoring them stage by stage, so mentors understanding the stages and knowing how to support graduates through those particular stages, is very important to the success of that mentorship relationship. Knowledge translation, we were hoping that this would eventually, these kinds of programs and the research would help us understand what could help new graduates stay in the workplace, senior nurses feel as though they were valued for their mentorship role, and in achieving both of those, how do we change the culture within the workplace to be supportive of new practitioners and sort of nurturing our own, if you will. Next slide. So for our approach in particular, we used a couple of different strategies. We matched the new graduate nurses with their senior mentors, and we looked at the new graduate mentorship research and mentorship research in general. And certainly Tracy and Florriann are well-versed in the concept of mentorship as an idea. So they contributed a great deal to our understanding of that in this project. And we intentionally matched them. And it's really interesting because there's mixed views on that, you know, but I think it worked out incredibly well. We used a process of getting to know the mentors and getting to know the mentees personally as well as professionally, and tried to match their schedules, tried to match, we put one particular fellow with a male mentor and then a female with a male. And it's interesting that those both rolled out beautifully. It was not that a male with a male was absolutely necessary, certainly in this research. And I think that it's more about the personality of the people and the willingness, honestly, it's the willingness of that mentor to just open themselves to the experience of that new graduate that I think dictated whether or not it was a success. We had a mixed methodology in that we used both, we kind of triangulated the methods. We had the qualitative interviews, and we used the professional role transition risk assessment instrument to take a look at a lot of elements in their initial transition experience and how that changed over time. Next slide, please. That was the instrument.
All right, so Tracy and I will cover the timeline, and pop in, Judy, anytime, because you've lived this through and through from beginning to end. We've started way back in April 2019, and time has flown by because of the pandemic and whatnot, and we'll get into that as well. But we had a beginning meeting of, you know, what do we need, and Judy has brought in so much of her knowledge and her past work on how would we move forward. And so we had many meetings and ethics and grant money coming in, and you saw the large team in the very first slide of who was all involved. It took a bit of coordinating, but by May, we were able to connect with folks that'd be interested in being mentors and mentees, and developed by July a workshop and hosted a workshop. And that workshop took a lot of coordinated effort, and we thank Judy for her organizational ability and inviting us all on board with this amazing work. The workshop itself took part on the RAH location, and we used their simulation labs and their big theater, and it was just an amazing whirlwind day where pairing took place between the mentor and mentee, and several different workshops and information sessions, and basically just launching the research work itself. And I was able to take part in putting together a simulation scenario for the partners to get together and go over an anti-bullying strategy using cognitive rehearsal training, for example. Tracy spoke about preceptorship roles and responsibilities. And so yeah, there was quite a nice mix that Judy put together in coordinating the launching of the work itself. And then right after, we realized we also need to have a control group on those folks that may have not had a formal mentorship experience, and invites were put out through BCCNP and BCNU to survey BC grads who have not, what their perceptions were of their experience being new graduates. So we had these control group and also this experiential group. And then Judy launched into her big interviews. She had 3 different interviews that she had put together for our experimental group, and feel free to jump in, Judy, if I'm missing anything, but I know that they took part in your constructs work. And before the interview, they would take part in an experiential project together and work together as a mentor and a mentee. And then you would interview them afterwards. And I believe that was at 1 month, 2 months, and at 6 months that you had met them for this qualitative data gathering. We can switch to the next slide because I'll talk about it. And there's one more timeline slide. I know it looks really busy. It actually looks like a shock absorber picture where you're slowly going through the motions of it. By the time we were able to get out the second survey to our control group. That was in January, and Judy was finishing up with her third round of interviews. And then, wow, you just snuck it all in there, Judy. Then the pandemic became the spotlight. So by the end of March there, things were wrapping up for your qualitative data, and you were able to collect all the quantitative data too. And we were really hoping to wrap things up by hosting a second workshop to just tie up all loose ends and thank everyone, but that did not happen. That was planned in April, and unfortunately, COVID, the swear word, came about. So you can see our timeline, and because the research assistants, which I'll talk about in a second, we're graduating and finishing up. Judy is now looking at the last bit of data and analyzing it, working on it, and finishing it up on her own. And but to keep it all rigorous, we have to keep the same person on board and not change the process. So there will be an end product, but a lot of work along the way has happened as well, which I'll share with you. So we can move to the next slide. And just wanted to give you a quick little breakdown of what we have actually completed to date. And it's not all of it, but it certainly is the main bit. So of course, we put that big workshop together in July where there was an orientation and a pairing of the new graduate nurses and the mentors, and our N equals 6 and 6 for that. We had an initial transition shock survey that was put together, and the participants answered that survey. Then we had the training for cognitive rehearsal and simulation for anti-bullying, and that was all in July with that experimental group. We then also had contacted, like I said, the control group, and at that point, the initial survey that was answered, N equals 98, so we had 98 surveyors in there, and when they completed the second survey, we were able to get 46 of them from the first 98, which is actually great because we know that life is busy for our new grads. So we were really happy to have even the 46 answers. So we thank all of them for doing that. The experiential group, like I said, went through a pairing exercises that were put together by Judy using her theory from her amazing professional role transition work. And by the way, I put in on the slide here, Surviving to Thriving, Navigating the First Year of Professional Nursing Practice. This is a book that you can get online, and it works through all of the different parts that Judy has integrated into our research, and the exercises are in there, and they also clearly lay out the different levels of transition and moments that our new graduates go through. And whether there's a pandemic or not, it still fits. It really does work. I've read it again thinking, how has this pandemic shifted? But it hasn't really, I mean, the work is still very relevant and makes sense. It's like timeless almost. And then we've also taken this work and had some preliminary findings presented at a Canadian Student Nurse Association conference where Judy got actually awarded second place. Way to go. Is that true? You can unmute it.
Actually, there were students that presented at this.
They presented it. Your research
they presented it, and they were given that a second place award. Yeah. Yes.
And you had an amazing group, and I want to speak to them too about them afterwards. These amazing now new graduate nurses. And then we presented at Causin in May. It was a virtual presentation, which we've all had to, I hate the word pivot, but we've had to sort of change our way of how we're presenting like we are right now. I'd love to see you all personally, but we're talking over a computer with each other. Tracy, did you want to say anything next? Because I've kind of stole your thunder.
No, it's okay. I'll take the next slide.
Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So that's kind of what we've gone up to date with. Okay, and
so as with any research, we know it's so important to. Yeah, we have the next slide. As with any research, it's important that we have the rigor with the process, and with data collection. All the data collection and the interviews took part in the same location, and to keep communication clear, there was one individual research assistant that was assigned to each pair, the mentor and the mentee, and the participants used their preferred mode of communication to set up the interviews. And overall, all the interviews were mostly conducted on time and data was fully collected. Now, for the rigor in handling the data, there was definitely clear communication between Judy, the PI, and the 3 RAs. They were the only ones that had access to the raw data. I'm sorry, our computer went off. Are we still on?
I think so. I can see.
Okay, sorry.
Okay,
It just
we have
our-
a blank screen.
We had a blank screen. So we'll
I just
continue
want
on.
to add something if I could.
Yes.
I'm sure everyone noticed at the start where it was outlined who was on the team. I'm not sure if Andrea Burrows is here today, but Andrea was absolutely instrumental. It seems like forever ago, doesn't it, Andrea, that we got together around this work, but we met several times in my home with the RAs. Andrea brought a tremendous lens to this research, both in initial analysis and just in thinking about how we ought to go about our communications and data analysis. So I just wanted to acknowledge Andrea. Thank you.
No, this was quite an extensive research endeavor, especially Judy, the PI, trying to organize all the pieces and parts. And, and during COVID, it just sort of added another layer, of course. But the handling of the data is also very essential, and clear communication between Judy at all times with the research assistants. There were numerous meetings to ensure that any questions that came up were answered. And I know Andrea's input was extremely valuable to this process, especially on the acute care side with these mentors and mentees at Royal Island Hospital. One of the ways that the data was sort of collected was through Google Docs. So all the research assistants, and the PI had access to Google Docs. So changes or additions to data or clarification could be easily met. And also, was as with any grounded theory approach, for those of us that have participated in this, we know it can be very confusing because there's lots of notes, lots of memos, lots of interactions, and the data collection isn't always clear. But each PI, our research assistants that were assigned to each mentor and mentee made it definitely much easier for this process. And also, of course, the coding of the transcripts was done as a group to ensure the continuity. And eventually, research assistants do graduate. So some of that work in the end falls back onto the PI, which, of course, that was Judy taking over. But I think overall, with the rigor, it was done exceptionally well. And any questions that came up were answered with no challenges.
I have to say, I was so super impressed with how our research assistants were so immersed in the whole grounded theory piece. They were practicing it, living it, and really, I think they were role models really well, Judy, by your work. Sorry to pat my coworker on the back publicly so much, with shamelessly, but really, anyone that does this kind of research with a huge group, the way that Judy's put this together, it's just made it flawless. And our research assistants, they came in with wonderful skills already, but I believe that their communication ability, their comfort to present and talk about the research and just coordinating things, I mean, they really, their skills became quite enhanced. So that's an important piece that we have to, I think we need to share that.
We can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Tracy, may I offer just something here? I guess I just want to echo all that, because the research assistants, two of those research assistants continued on to do other research work with me, and they were part of the developmental team for Nursing the Future, which is the national organization for new graduate support in Canada. So, they were able to continue that work, and it was really exciting. They were involved in all of the interviews, which was really important to note, because they sat in the background and they listened to the interview and made their own notes. And then at the end of each interview, we debriefed, and those became part of the notes of that particular interview. And we went from one interview to the next, which is your basic grounded theory approach, so that one informed the other. So sometimes there were questions that I would ask in the next interview that had been informed by the first interview. I'm trying to, I think that was everything. Thanks so much for letting me jump in.
No, please do. So now we're going to talk about some of the challenges with the research process. So Florriann and I will be tag teaming each other in this slide.
Sure.
But as we just spoke to, one of the challenges, of course, was communication, or could have been communication if the PI wasn't as involved in the research project and trying to manage 3 research assistants, including all the data that was coming in from, you know, the qualitative data with the interviews and also the quantitative data with the surveys. So the communication we've identified as a challenge, but it doesn't mean that it actually was, because the communication was clear.
And the participants themselves, the very essence that you got new graduate nurses, you've got these seasoned senior nurses that are working different schedules and trying to connect them together and communicate with them. You know, that could have been a challenge. But I think this again shines that when you have someone who's very organized and mentoring at the same time how to be organized with research assistants, and also technology. I mean, we've realized now we're using computers now, Google Docs, for example, to put stuff in together, texting each other. It's much easier than picking up the phone or chasing people in person these days. Like, technology really, for any future research, I strongly say embrace it, use it. It really does help.
And I'm going to say too, the coordination of the initial workshop, I know when Judy invited me on, I couldn't believe the numbers involved in this workshop, and I did not know how it was going to turn out. And being there, it was so like a well-oiled machine. It went really well. I know that the feedback from the nurses, the mentors, was extremely positive. So kudos to Judy for trying to manage and coordinate that initial workshop. It was a lot of work. We had also, of course, Andrea and Tracy Scott and the other side, and myself were doing the preceptorship, you know, discussion with the mentors and mentee. And then you had Florriann and Michelle Seibel, of course, and all the Sims, you know, with Renee Anderson and so forth. So it was really coordinated. It took a lot of time. And I couldn't believe, Judy, you even got Dr. Treisman in to be part of that simulation, which was amazing. Anyway, did you want to talk about
in case people are wondering about the simulation too?
Yeah. Yeah.
We had multiple folks involved, like an interdisciplinary team, and a situation where there was a bullying moment going on, right? And so we had a person who was playing a patient. We had Dr. Treisman playing the doctor, and we had different roles occurring, and basically it really got into it. But the nice thing about it, after experiencing that simulation as a collaborator, is I actually took some feedback and observations from that moment and was able to spin it off and use it for other pieces too. So even though there was one main theme of research happening, sometimes you end up getting nice ideas about other research projects or enhancing your own research work too. So there's some neat things there I just wanted to throw in. And I know that's not a challenge, but it was just that coordination, all that. There's actually some benefits that were quite apparent afterwards. So just wanted to
Florriann and Tracy, may I offer a word about the sim?
Sure.
Because I think people need to understand that was a huge piece, and everybody, I mean, it took a village, as we say, and it really did take a village. So the one thing I was really crystal clear on that I found the most exciting part about this sim was I wanted it to be incredibly realistic. And I wanted to really push those new graduates. I wanted to push them to see how they would respond. And then when they were understandably challenged and expectedly challenged, because we expected that, Florriann and Michelle Seibel and their cognitive research allowed us to take that scenario, stop it, debrief immediately on it, and then replay the scenario in a healthy, reprogrammed way for the new graduates, so that it ultimately was very successful for them. And this is the bicultural piece, in that they come in with this idea of how they should behave with physicians, for instance. That's why the physician had to be involved. And patients and families. And Sheila Blackstock, I don't know if she's here, but she was the best wife ever. Because she was just, just got totally immersed in it. And family is very difficult for a new graduate to deal with. When you've got family coming at you asking how come this isn't happening, and this, and they're anxious, and Sheila just played that role beautifully, and the new grads responded really well to that kind of pressure. Really well, meaning they did what we expected them to do. Several of them got totally stymied, you know, they couldn't go any further. And then when we stopped it, debriefed and replayed it, they were able to walk through that scenario with confidence and came out of that scenario with a tremendous change in their own experience of working with families, working with physicians. But the one thing that I wanted to note, it's a good thing we do have an hour, Kim, because it looks like take it, is that the patient, by the way, was the father of one of the RAs. So this was a family affair. But what I noticed sort of when we were starting this process was everybody was tentative, right? This idea that wanted to protect the graduate, you know, don't be too hard on them. Well, that's not the reality that they're facing. That's not the reality that they're going into. And that's why I wanted to approach it from this very realistic perspective. So I had to push the physician, I would say, a fair bit. He was a very lovely man and didn't want to intimidate the new graduates. But as a rule, those aren't the physicians that new graduates have trouble with. And so it wouldn't have helped us to just walk through that like it was an easy thing. So he started to get a little bit more forceful, if you will. And we could see that difference in the way that the new graduate was responding. Same with the patient and same with the wife of the patient. They just took on that persona. And as the, you know, second and third scenarios came through, they started to feel more confident in their roles of pushing the graduates, because then they knew that we were going to revisit it and we would help them have a healthy outcome to that situation. So, that scenario, that sim scenario was really important.
Yeah, it's excellent. It was an excellent reminder that simulations really, to be useful, yeah, you have to remember your mind won't go where your body hasn't been. So you need to really make it as realistic as you can. And it's okay to have all hats off and go for it. There's a debriefing afterwards. It's all safe, right? But it has to seem real. And that was an important emphasis. And otherwise we can't move forward. Our new grads would be stuck. Because, you know, I do feel all theoretical, right? So
yeah, exactly, Florriann. And I'm feeling this in academia in general, really, that we are so concerned about making sure the students feel safe that I'm not sure that we're giving them enough of a realistic perspective of what the world is like out there. It isn't always safe. So yes. Are we better to have them feel like they are on that edge and help them with the skills and the tools they need to deal with when they don't feel safe? What are you going to do then?
Yeah.
So I would encourage us to think about that idea of safety as a preparation to have the skills to deal with unsafe situations, rather than always making people feel like, particularly in learning situation, that they're completely safe. I think we need to push that edge a little.
I agree. I mean, I see it when I have done a few workshops at the Justice Institute on bullying, and we go out right on it. We're using, I mean, we almost are a little bit too scary, but we want our newer police force or ambulance attendants and whatnot to graduate knowing the reality of the language out there, the context, the feeling that they're going to have, so that they're not frozen and they're not just putting themselves in an unsafe place. So it is super important to follow through with the reality of it. Okay, so I don't go off sidetracked. I also want to mention that, you know, when you're doing research, you have these plans and these timelines, but our new graduates, of course, they went into all the exercises that Judy put together, but at altered kind of stages of the transition that she had, just because the reality of their lives. They had varied work hours, and they needed to have a certain amount of hours for work experience. And so some of that transition of the work itself, some of them had to change from hours to months in the model that we were using. And that can make it kind of tough because the first 1 to 2 months is really important, especially when you're reading up on Judy's theory. That's where a lot of the important work happens. You know, that's where the initial shock occurs. And we need those hours to really build our confidence. And that's the unfortunate thing with some new graduates is they lose their confidence really fast. And I think there's a message there to IHA and beyond. When you're hiring new grads, they need their hours. They need that time to build up their confidence and skill acquisition. And but we were experiencing reality with our participants, right, Judy? I mean, this is how it works. But again, it just demonstrates the need for stability when you first get hired on as a new grad and having those hours so that you can go through the best transition and healthy transition. So we got to experience with our participants, and that was just the reality of it.
And in the midst of all this, we have COVID.
Oh, yes. So there you go. Other delays.
Another layer, probably another layer of stress. And we
Yeah.
know, you know, how healthcare is responding now. We can imagine as a new graduate, what kind of layer that added to them for stress.
Yeah.
And so, but with all the, even though with COVID, the research continues on. Judy, as a PI, we're now going to ask Judy, do you mind sharing some of the preliminary findings?
Great. Thanks so much, you guys. That was a great overview of our research process. Thank you. I just wanted to make a note before I forget, if I do forget, and that is this idea that Florriann brought up about what I noticed with several of the grads that were in the study was that they were pacing themselves really well, a little bit too well, and they were, you know, they thought, I'm just going to really go easy. I'm going to go easy. And then they started to experience the normal anxieties of transition, and that frightened them. And so they backed up even more, and that delayed significantly their ability to transition to the workplace. So I would concur with Florriann to suggest that I do believe that those graduates who work casual, and when I say casual, I mean in terms of hours, not just a position, I think they're going to have a harder time transitioning. They don't socialize extremely well when they're moving from unit to unit, or they don't work with the same lines. The socialization process is different. And certainly they're able to hide, and graduates do a really good job of hiding. And if you aren't careful and watching them very closely, they'll just slide on by and you won't even notice them or see them, and they're struggling and you don't know it. So I'll maybe point out a few more of those things, but something that I realized was that it's more about hours than it is about length of time. Because what I was noticing was those graduates that should have been out of the transition shock experience weren't. Well, why weren't they? So I kind of dove a little deeper into that with them and just looking at the research myself. And I realized that a lot of it was because they weren't working the same level of hours. So they weren't being immersed in that challenge so that they could literally get through the other side of it. They were still on this side of the challenge, if that sort of metaphor makes sense to people. So preliminarily, I think, I mean, this is like apple pie, right? The importance of a support network, surprise. I think there are a few things about the support network that I want to point out as we go along that are important that came out in this research, and the reason why I wanted to do it. Gradual and intentional workplace integration. This is, while I say that hours are important, time is important as well. So you can put the hours in, but you just have to keep plugging away. There's nothing we can do in a classroom that's going to change the fact that you have to go through this transition. And I think that's one thing when we're trying to help graduates through a transition is we try to say, well, what else do you need? What else do you need? I need time. I need time, and I need to practice. And I need you to intentionally, that's the intentional piece, put me in a variety of situations that you scaffold for me. So throwing me into the deep end is really not a good idea. Watching me closely, understanding my transition, my cognitive capacity, which is limited at the beginning, and building my practice experiences slowly. So I always, and when I work with senior students and their preceptors, I talk to those preceptors about it's better to increase the number of patients before you increase the complexity and the intensity. So you give them a couple of patients, they do very well with it, give them another relatively stable patient, and until they get up to what would normally be an accepted workload. Once they're managing that workload, then you start to manipulate the chaos and complexity. Clearly, the challenges we're having now is that it's hard for us. The chaos and complexity is manipulating us. So it's really hard to process that for the new graduate as intentionally as we would like, but that's the ideal situation. If you can think about that. I know IH is implementing a clinical mentors program now, and I just got connected with a couple of those clinical mentors, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, which I'm really excited, and thank you Interior Health for implementing that program. I'm looking forward to seeing it unfold. Shifts in the transition experience and employment. I think what I noticed was that there was a lot more casual working than I want to jump into a full-time line or a permanent line. And that it was a remarkable change from my prior studies. So this was my 9th study, and the other studies, I did not see that kind of, I really don't want to work. I really would like to just dabble in my work, but I'm here to just travel. And I felt it was relatively representative. I think we have a different demographic out there. Next slide, please. So talking about the support network, the mentor's knowledge of new graduate transition is imperative. I've always believed that it is, because it's like, if you don't understand that the graduate is in stage 1 and you're thinking that what they're looking for are professional opportunities, they can't see the forest for the trees. They can barely lift their head to gaze around them and can't even think about, what they're going to do a year from now. They can barely think about what they're going to do an hour from now. So if we don't understand where they're at, we throw supports at them that are great supports, but the wrong time. And then they don't work, and we're like, yeah, well, it just didn't work. Well, it didn't work oftentimes because it's the right strategy at the wrong time. So understanding the transition stages and phases is important. Social contacts. It didn't surprise me that their relationships with these mentors, that sense of belonging and acceptance that came from the mentors, and all of them experienced it, all of them. Some of them had a little harder time accepting themselves. And so it was a little bit more of a tenuous relationship with their mentor, but I don't think it was the mentor as much as it was their own insecurities. But that sense of belonging and acceptance, it's almost like it's hard for them to get past, it's hard for them to get past that unless you feed that acceptance to them, and then they relax and they can move forward. It's like until they have that, everything they do to belong and to be accepted. And that can get a little bit dangerous. If one of the ways they feel they can be accepted is if they do everything right, and if they don't show anybody that they're struggling. If that's the case, you've got a graduate that's concealing, and they're probably making errors that you don't know about. So that's why the belonging and acceptance is so important. The structured meetings, everybody in the study said this. They said they loved the fact that they were meeting at regular times. And Florriann alluded to this, but they were meeting according to the stages. So we met at 1 month, and then they had 1 month to 3 month exercises to do together. Then, and they were strategically developed to target the issues of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. So then the next interview was around 3 months. And yes, it did vary a little bit. And sometimes I doubled up on the interview. So I did several interviews with one person because I realized they weren't actually in the second stage. And so I waited a little bit longer until they were and did another interview. And then the final interview was somewhere between 6 to 8 months, which is the kind of into that third stage. Now, the structured meetings between mentor and mentee were very valued from both sides, as well as evidence-guided support processes. So that's where what you're meeting to talk about. Like generally, I encourage them to just talk, you know, how's life? How are you doing? How are you feeling? But that is not specific enough to be supportive, entirely supportive to the new graduate. They need you to ask them the questions that they are wanting to talk about in that particular stage. So in the first stage, the last thing they're going to tell you is, I feel like I want to hide in the bathroom every 5 minutes. So if you say to them, you know, it's very common in the first stage to feel like you can't share something because if I saw that you did that, you'd feel like I wouldn't accept you. That's very normal. Oh, okay. So if it's normal, then I can talk about it. If the mentors knew that and were given the questions, ask them these questions because this is where they'll be at. They asked them, and sure enough, they got this incredible response from the graduate because the graduate resonated with those questions. So that's why the evidence-guided support was so important. And relationships are critical. Certainly that no judgment zone where, you know, just talk to me. I'm not going to judge you for it. I want to support you. And I was so impressed with the mentors. You know, they were just all about that. They were just so caring and so committed to these graduates. And they went where the graduates were, not where they wanted them to be. Even though they said to me, oh, I just feel like this person should be over here, but they're not. So I'm here with them. They were really good about that. And I think that that's important for any of us to feel accepted. Next slide, please. The workplace integration. I've gone through a few of these, so I'll probably go through them a little bit faster. There is a demographic shift, I think. It would take more research for me to say that for sure. Pacing. This is where I felt if you don't pace me, I'll pace myself. And there were a few of them that in their practice experience, they were really struggling. And because the support for their struggle wasn't there, they pulled themselves away, which was good because they were able to pace themselves. But it wasn't good in the sense that their approach to pacing themselves actually put them behind their transition experience. And I felt that they really struggled to move through their stages. Traumatic events early on influence a new nurse's transition experience. And I have felt that for quite some time. There were several situations that were so alarming to these graduates that months later, they were still there. And when I would bring it up to them, it would evoke tears. And so clearly they were still back in that experience. That's why the success of a new graduate and putting them in a situation where they are going to be successful is really important. And well, don't we know this one? The work challenges and overtime and working short, that's just normal in the workplace now. I don't even like to say that because it shouldn't be normalized in the workplace. And I have real concerns since COVID that this normalization is driving graduates out of the workplace. So that's not in this study, but I think we need to talk about it. Certainly Nursing the Future has exposed a fair bit of that. Previous placements, and I felt this from my previous research, is that if they have a final practicum or an ESN or a CPE3 in particular, that's a more senior practicum, they do find a sense of familiarity with the units that they're on. That's really important. The challenge with it, particularly if they do their final practicum, is if the institution feels that you've been orientated, because you haven't, but it's almost like you have because you've spent time there. The challenge is that when they move from student into actually being a graduate nurse and then registered nurse, the lens that they have on what they're doing is very different. So they do require that orientation and that time, even though you think that they should know the place quite well. We know acute care is a challenging place to be. It has been for a long time, and it will always be that way. Adaptability is learned over time, and this is my point about the time. Graduates need that time before they're immersed completely in their roles and responsibilities. Yeah, and just this idea that a graduate can gather all the data that they need, but being able to process all that information and integrate that into a care plan, and then manipulating that information when things don't look the way that they did in a textbook, that just takes a lot of time. And again, practice. Next slide, please. So I did offer a few thoughts in terms of the data on the experience of employment. And there's a lot of talk out there now about kind of how is it best to employ these new nurses. And I do think that hours worked is important. And Florriann hit the nail on the head when she said that the casualization, those were the graduates I felt really struggled the most, as the ones that probably worked under 0.5. In fact, I think a 0.7 is almost an ideal amount of work for a new graduate. It allows them enough time when they're off to relax and even process what happened. The full time, the 1.0s, it's exhausting for them initially. They do want a work-life balance, don't we all? I think that they're more willing than graduates in past years to forego the money for that balance. And so if we can't give them that balance, they'll find ways to take it. So it's important to know that. Days versus nights. Well, this was another interesting finding. One grad in particular who was struggling stayed on nights because nights are just less busy. You have more time to process the information about the patients, but they got to a point where they were terrified to work a day shift, and the staff that were around them were concerned that they wouldn't cope very well because they'd become, they'd worked up this anxiety around days, and if they didn't have to work them, then they chose not to. I mean, who doesn't want to limit their anxiety? And a lot of the shifts that became available were nights. So this is where the challenge came with casualizing their work, is that most of those shifts were nights. The new graduates' level of energy is very predictive of their coping. And I want to emphasize these foundational elements of a new graduate's experience: stability, consistency, predictability, and familiarity. If they have those personally and professionally, they are much more likely to be successful. And I focus a lot of that in my theory. And problem solving and conflict management nowadays is occurring in these really rapidly changing and highly complex and chaotic cultures and contexts. And that's a bit challenging for the new nursing graduates. So we have to be even more intentional about how we control for that in who we give them as a patient load. And there's a big question about how we're preparing students for the environment that they're entering. And again, that's a long discussion. So that sort of does our preliminary presentation on findings. There's a lot, obviously, that went on with COVID that really stymied a bit my ability to move forward with the analysis. So that analysis is really being focused on now. And again, I wanted to thank Andrea Burrows because she was absolutely critical in our moving through ethics, in initial work with the RAs, in the analysis. And I know Andrea's moved on to different roles, but she's still a very valued member of this team. So any questions for the three of us?
Thank you all so much for that presentation. I was really excited in the background to it. I wasn't a nurse, but I was a medical device reprocessing technician for a long time, and I can see the value in mentorship and in the simulation, right? And especially in high stress environments. We already have a question that's come through, so I have questions in the background though, of course, because as I say, I was very excited for your presentation. And I wanted to give also a shout out to Andrea Burrows, who is currently still off on mat leave, but she's expected to return soon. And our department misses her so much. So we're so excited for when she does return. And I know she'll be ecstatic to hear this presentation was featured in IH Research Week. So Elisabetta asks, or says and then asks, the typical orientation time is 2 weeks for a new grad and then they're on their own. Considering the nursing staff shortages, how do you propose to overcome the challenge of transitioning new grads into the workforce with limited or no staff to mentor them past 2 weeks?
Florriann and Tracy, did you want to offer anything to that question?
We have to realize that it is super dangerous to just throw their feet to the fire. We can't speed things up and just say, oh, we have this nursing shortage, just throw them in. You can't. We'll actually lose them faster than gaining them. So we have to stick to the steady pace of transition, give them the hours they need, the 0.7 or whatever it is for what Judy was suggesting, and be realistic that they are not going to speed up and catch up during a pandemic. The reality is we have to still follow through with the transition patterns. And yeah, we have to hire them, yes, but the mentorship still has to be there.
Tracy, anything before I offer my thoughts?
Yeah, no, so for my research focuses on the preceptorship piece, and that transitions are actually right into Judy's research and looking at the transition with these new grads. And for me, my research, of course, has shown the importance of that preceptorship, and which Judy, you've alluded to as well, where these new graduates are familiar with the unit. So when you have these students that are preceptored on a unit and they get hired into the same unit, it does lessen some of the stress for them. And it's even better when that preceptor who they had eventually could become a mentor to them. So looking at where there's more continuity, of course. Now I'll pass it on to you, Judy.
Thanks, Tracy. I want to hammer some things home here before our time is done, because there are real things that can be done in the workplace to help these individuals, Kim. First of all, there's 2 initiatives that Nursing the Future is working on and will be promoting starting January when we are back in business. And the first is called Storm Chasers. And there is, in my mind, we need to be thinking about how do we support new graduates with support that they resonate with. And Storm Chasers is a program where we develop the transition expertise of recent graduates. So graduates between 1 to 3 years. We will give them a training program on transition, give them training on chaos management, crisis intervention, experiences of transition, and they, grassroots wise, will support the new graduates that are coming in from 0 to 1 year. So that's one initiative that I think the health region can be involved in. And I've already had conversations with Annetta and a number of your interior health individuals around being part of the pilot for that. The second thing is what you're doing here, which is clinical mentors. That's what the shock absorber program is going to be in Nursing the Future. And that is a similar program except for clinical mentors. Train them on transition, give them the tools. So all those questions that I talked about you needing to ask a new graduate at the right times, that will be part of that shock absorber package. So it's a matter of pulling the support from those senior individuals. And these clinical mentors, if I'm not mistaken, are individuals that are supernumerary to that role. That's really important. And the final thing, I've got like 1 minute, is we need a culture and we need a context, a workplace worth waking up to. That's a mouthful. So we can't be just talking about new graduates. We have to talk about the nurses that they're working with. Those nurses need to feel valued and supported, and they need appropriate staffing for them to do their roles and feel like they have enough energy and, quite frankly, optimism about their profession and what they're doing to to pull in a new graduate and say, this is the most amazing profession you could ever imagine. That's what we all want to say. And we need to support those nurses as well. This is a family of nurses that need to be supported. Thank you. I think that's our time.
Thank you. And then the response was amazing answers. Thank you. And you're getting tons of thank yous in the comments as well. For any other additional questions, I am happy to facilitate beyond this presentation. So if anybody would like to email me, my email's under my face, or you're welcome to email research@interiorhealth.ca, and we can facilitate and connect you to Judy, Florriann, and Tracy. Thank you three for presenting today with us. We sincerely appreciate it, and we look forward to what's next for shock absorbers. Thanks so much,
Thank you
everybody.
for the opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely our pleasure.
The
Take
attendee.
care, everyone, and I hope to see you at tomorrow's events. Night.
Thanks, everyone.